For those of you who can't tell, I am not an 8-year-old kid, so this is not first-hand knowledge when I talk about this bike, but this is taking probably 10 years of selling full suspension mountain bikes to parents. And so first off, what is this that we're looking at here with the Rift Zone Jr? This is a proper kid's full suspension mountain bike. And unlike bikes that are dramatically cheaper than this that are full suspension, this is to get proper performance and to actually help your kid to ride tougher terrain, bumpier terrain with more confidence. Unlike those cheap bikes where I would say they look like full suspension bikes, but in reality all they are is really heavy versions of things that look like mountain bikes, or mountain bikes that are attached to pogo sticks. In neither case do they make your kid's life any better as far as riding goes. All they do is maybe for a second get your kid excited in the case of those cheap bikes because they have a bike that looks kind of cool. This thing is legit and will make your kid's riding experience that much better. And that is basically where this bike sits in the marketplace. It is for the kid in a family where the parents are into mountain biking and they are going to do everything in their power to make sure that their kid loves riding so that this can become a family activity. So that is what this guy is. It is $21.99 in Canada. So for a lot of people, that is going to seem like an absolutely ridiculous amount for a kid's bike. For those people that think that, I would say tune out, because this bike isn't for you. For a lot of people, and we see this on a pretty regular occasion, because mountain biking is such a big part of their own lives, whether it's $21.99, $26.99, $30.99, whatever, if it's in that range, if they're really confident that it's going to make their kids' bike riding life that much more fun, they don't care. And the fact that it's $2,000 or $3,000 is not a factor. So we'll talk about at the end of this video if this is way out of your price range, and if you actually do care about giving your kid the best experience. You don't have to go as far as a full suspension. There are ways, and we do have bikes, I can see one across the store right now, that make a really good riding experience for the kid, just not quite as supple as what we're going to see on a full suspension bike. So $21.99 in Canada. I'll give you a US price, maybe up there or over there, something like that on the screen. This is a 33.3 pound bike. So that is sort of adult weight for bikes, but it's very hard to get a lot of these components on these bikes to be much lighter than that. And that's because we're looking at essentially a slightly shorter version of an adult type of crank, basically an adult version of a drivetrain, adult version of tires that are just shrunk down a little bit. The frame, all of those things are just slightly shrunk down versions of adult bikes. So if this was an adult bike, it would be 36 pounds with all the same bits and pieces. We save a couple pounds because it's miniaturized, but still quite good. And still, if we talk about that boat anchor that I was talking about with the bikes that look like full suspension, I wouldn't be surprised if this is in the neighborhood of 10 pounds lighter than a lot of those things that look like full suspension mountain bikes. 130 millimeters of suspension, both back and front on this bike. So that puts this, if that's on an adult bike, that puts it squarely in the middle of the short travel trail bike sort of range. I would say, because we're talking about a smaller bike overall, that 130 millimeters of travel is going to equate maybe to being a little bit more like an adult bike with, say, 150 millimeters of travel. Everything is smaller in this case. So this is a little bit more of a do-it-all sort of a trail bike, not a short travel trail bike, sort of concentrating on people who are after an efficient cross-country-esque type of a thing. So in this video, we're going to go over, you've got the amount of travel, you've got the price, you've got the weight. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a bunch of the details of this bike that make this bike worth that $21.99. And as I mentioned earlier, at the end, I'm going to go over 3 bikes that basically constitute the 3 best ways you can spend your money, depending on how that money is, in this sort of a category. And then I'll also bring up the other way that you can actually get your kid on a bike that's going to give them a really good riding experience for a proper mountain bike. Still, for a lot of people, the thing I'll bring up at the end of the video is going to be too expensive, but we're talking about mountain bikes in this case, not bikes shaped like mountain bikes that are essentially bikes for the sidewalk and for shooting around the cul-de-sac. So that's where we're headed with this video. So if you hadn't caught on before from the name of this bike, the Rift Zone Jr24, the 24 in this case is talking about the wheel diameter. This review is going to be incredibly useful as well for anybody that looks at the Rift Zone Jr26, because it is literally the exact same bike with the exception of that wheel size. And that is one of the things that makes this particular bike really special, is the fact that you can buy a 24 for your kid that's maybe 4'2", and then when he starts to outgrow this bike, you can buy a set of 26-inch wheels to replace these 24-inch wheels, and you are going to be able to then extend the life of this bike to probably being useful for in the neighborhood of 5 years, something like that. So for a lot of parents, the one thing to consider, they always ask this question: how long is this bike going to last? And I would say, well, I don't have a clue, because I don't know how fast your kid's going to grow, but it's very typical on junior bikes to see about 2 years of use out of the bikes. One thing to consider with that, this thing at its $21.99 price range, that bike in a couple of years, I mean, a lot of parents have multiple kids, so they can just pass it down, but also we tend to find that there's a lot of parents who are willing to save a little bit of money getting a scratched up 2-year-old, 4-year-old bike, depending on how many kids it's gone through. And they would say, go buy this thing down the road in a couple of years for $1,500 off one of their friends. So don't look at the bike as an absolute cost of that $21.99, but look at it as that 2 or 3 year rental that maybe it's costing you $600 by the time you're done. And that $600 has bought you a really good chance of getting your kid totally hooked on riding bikes. Never mind being the coolest kid in the neighborhood if you've got this thing and you're blasting around going off jumps and stuff like that. So 24-inch wheels, front and rear, 130 millimeters, front and rear. When we look at these rims, these are tubeless ready rims, but these V tire flow snap tires are not tubeless ready themselves, and the rims are not taped to be tubeless. So if you wanted to geek out, yeah, maybe you could put tubeless tires on here, but I suspect that for a lot of parents, all that extra work is not sort of in their wheelhouse of things that they want to do. We're looking at a suspension design here that is a single pivot. So we have one pivot there, we have another pivot there. So that means that that rear wheel is working on a very simple arc around this. And then this would be called a linkage driven single pivot. None of that really matters these days, because all the bike companies have figured out the magic between where they put this and then how they drive the shock, that you get really, really good efficiency and don't have to have a lockout on that rear shock. Now, when I was mentioning at the beginning of the video, talking about this being $21.99 and the fact that there's a lot of cheaper bikes that kind of look like this, that are sort of, look at me, I look like a full suspension bike, but they don't actually give your kid the value of a full suspension bike. One of the big things about that is the quality of the suspension. On both this rear shock and on the fork, this is using air suspension. And that is going to be one of the talking points, especially at the end of this video when I discuss the 3 sort of best in category bikes, this plus 2 that it competes with, and how integral the quality of those components are to the overall value of the bike. If I hadn't mentioned it yet, I think in the sub $2,500 bike category for this sort of thing, I think that this is the standout. The fact that we get that switchability from the 24 to 26 is huge. The fact that it's using the same frame, and I don't think it really compromises to be able to achieve that, fantastic. Carrying on with specifications, we have an 11-speed Shimano Q's drivetrain on here. So this is actually a Shimano Q's cassette, 11-speed with an 11-speed KMC chain on here, and then that Shimano Q's derailleur. Now, of importance on these derailleurs, and this is becoming a thing that I shouldn't have to mention, but a lot of parents don't know that there are derailleurs that have clutches on them and some that don't. And now what a clutch will do, this is the clutch in the off position, this is the clutch in the on position. And so that clutch is making things really stiff in this little knuckle down here. That is helping to control the chain, which when combined with a narrow wide chain ring on here, you basically minimize the likelihood of bouncing a chain off, and you also quieten the chain quite a bit from bouncing around, making a lot of noise, chipping the paint on this bike. And in addition, you also have a really good rubber guard here to protect the paint as the kid is going blasting through some roots and rocks. Now, the reason that they give you the off position on these derailleurs is so that if you ever got a flat, you need to take your rear tire or rear wheel off, you're not battling all out of that extra chain tension. For those unfamiliar, Shimano Qs at this level, at least in the 11 speed, I would say is awfully close to being in the range of a Shimano Dior sort of a drivetrain for overall quality. Quite similar, got a clutch, the same, I believe 10 to 51 or 10 to 50 tooth, 1150 for the gear range here. So massive range of gears on this bike. Now, this is a little bit rare actually seeing an 1150 cassette on a kid's bike. And the reason for that is if we go looking down here, and if you look at how low the bottom of this derailleur is, we're looking at very little clearance between the derailleur and the ground. And so that is where we have something. I'm not going to say this is a bad design because we have a big trade-off here. We have either offering the kid a massive range of gears, so there's going to be a chance that they're going to make it up the climb behind you, and in which case you have a downside of your derailleur hanging so low, or you go with less gears and a smaller range of gears, so maybe topping out at 46 teeth or 48 teeth instead of this 50, and your derailleur not being as close to the ground. So neither of those are better or worse. They are purely trade-offs. So just a thing to consider though on this. It is, especially when you go into that sort of up around this gear here, the sort of second easiest, third easiest, you definitely see that the bottom of the derailleur, that bottom pulley, is getting close to the ground. Not a bad thing or a good thing, just a thing that needs some consideration. Now, one criticism I have of this bike is just in the spec on the crank length. Considering we're looking at a bike with 24-inch wheels in this case, I think that there's a little bit of an error here. This bike is using a 152 millimeter long crank, and considering now, even for somebody my height, 6 foot to 6'1", I would be using a 165 to 170 to only be losing about 13 millimeters on this crank length, considering we're talking about a rider half the height in relative terms. To me, that 152 isn't short enough. In a couple of the bikes that I mentioned once again at the end of the video, what we'll see in well thought out versions of this bike is going to be something in the 135 to 140 for crank length. So that is my criticism there. Not a game ender or anything, and a lot of kids are just so clueless that they don't notice, but I think for cycling parents, it is the thing that you're going to notice. We have a dropper seat post on here. It's a relatively short drop. I think that's about 100 mil drop. I suspect that there may be cases that even this is going to be too long for some kids. So in that case, you're either going to have kids riding with this thing at sort of half mast, which at least is easy enough to do on a bike like this, and then growing into the full height, or dropping down to an aftermarket really short dropper seat post. The dropper remote up here doesn't seem to take excessive amounts of pressure, but this isn't a kids specific sort of a setup here. So it does take a little bit more of a noticeable push compared to bikes like say the Giant Faith that seem to have used a kids specific dropper post on there. Of positive note, and once again, this is sort of tying back to the Giant Faith, that my criticism on that bike was the seat was too big. This is a proper junior sized saddle on here. It's got a little bit of padding, but at least it's not excessively long, so the kid's not going to hang their belt up on the nose of the saddle or anything like that. So going back to the suspension on this bike does use X Fusion suspension front and rear, and this is a very common spec amongst a number of brands, and I think it's because these guys do offer a relatively light tune, and they offer a pretty sort of low price point version of an air shock. Now, key features on this, we've got an air valve, so that's where we get to change the air pressure for the kid, and then we've got a rebound adjustment. This isn't a criticism, this is just a reflection of what happens at this price. I don't think that this thing is optimized around, say, a 60-pound kid, which is a very realistic sort of a weight for a kid getting on here. What you'll tend to find in that case is that you're either having to ride this a little bit firmer to sort of not bottom it out too easy, or if you're at it too soft, the hydraulic dampening that happens inside the shock is a little bit too much. And what that does is it kind of gives you a little bit of extra stiction, both compressing, and then the rebound is slowed down a little bit. So that is the one reason this is good and a heck of a lot better than any of those coil spring pogo sticks on the things that just look like full suspension. But this is where the rear shock and the fork, where if somebody's going to spend $1,000 more on their kid's bike than this, that is in many cases the key reason that they would make sense of doing that. And I will say, because I've been thinking about this video for a bit, this bike, this X Fusion on here, is working better than what I have seen in previous years. So this is slowly improving in general, the fact that the valving is getting better for light riders, but I would still say not quite optimized for extremely light riders, the kind that would be on a bike like this. Geometry angles on this bike are quite modern. I'll put them somewhere above the video somewhere as I'm talking about it here. They're modern angles. It's nice in general that we see this bike. The general sort of proportions of the bike are totally in line with what we see from parents' bikes, with the one exception being the rear ends on the kids' bikes tend to be a little bit long in comparison to the front end reach. But that is a limitation that is brought on by the wheel, by the crank, by the chain ring, and by the fact that if those two things get too close to each other, our shifting actually doesn't work very well in the back because our chain angle starts to get really wacky. So that's why we sometimes see some limitations and why a lot of kids' bikes tend to have longer rear ends. As a plus side, that longer rear end provides some stability. So when your kid is acting like an idiot and doing things that you know are well above their pay grade, this bike is going to be a little bit of a safety net and help to stay upright by having a little bit longer rear end on there. Going forward, we're looking at Tektro hydraulic disc brakes. These are not a junior specific version on here, which is something that we do see on fancier versions. They're reasonable. There is an adjustment right in here with an Allen key, so you can actually get these things so the preset is much closer to the grips, so you can get it to be quite usable. We also see on here, this is a standard grip. This isn't a junior size grip or anything. This would be the one place I'd maybe give a little bit more criticism here. We've got cranks that are maybe a little bit too long. These grips are probably a little bit fat for a lot of kids' hands. So hunting around for an aftermarket grip that really tries to get as small a diameter here as possible is going to give a kid the right riding experience. Now back to talking about the gears. We do have a Shimano style trigger shifter here. So on these we have a thumb push there to get into an easier gear, and we have in the front we can either push that or pull that, and that's going to take us back into a harder gear. So that is something at this sort of price point that's not a surprise, but I know at much cheaper price points it's something that a lot of parents want on their junior bike, but a lot of bikes force the kids into using a grip shift style shifter. So at least we've got proper quality there. The fact that it is a Q's level 11 speed is maybe even reaching a step or two better than what a lot of parents would expect, I'd say, quite honestly. We do have internal cable routing, pretty cleanly done. This is something that used to be worth mentioning because there were so many internal cable routing jobs that were just kind of ugly. We've got water bottle cages or cage mounts on here. I would say that this space that we have here, that's pretty tight to try and get an adult size bottle and cage. So we sell quite a number of the giant ARX water bottles and cages, and it's just a slightly minimized overall size for the bottle and the cage to work in a particularly tight front triangle like we're dealing with here. Heading to the front wheel, we're looking at this, or front fork at least, we're looking still, X Fusion being the brand, 130 millimeter travel, this Velvet 26, so this is where they're getting the upgradability to a 26-inch wheel, is they use a 26-inch fork with a 24-inch wheel, so that we just have a little bit of excess room here, which is giving us that extra room to be able to put a bigger wheel on. But I mean, realistically, it's only meaning that the front end of the bike is sitting an inch higher than what it would be if that was a 24-inch fork. And also it means that we're probably getting into a better range of forks by this being 26, once you're at 24s, the amount of options you get for a good quality fork are kind of minimal. If we look up here, we do have some minor adjustment as far as your compression adjustments, so wide open to pretty locked out there, sort of a standard feature. We go down and we see this red knob, that's your rebound adjustment, and that's one place, as I mentioned, talking about the valving and the rear shock. This is one place, like when I set this thing up for what would feel appropriate for a really lightweight kid, that rebound is still a little bit heavy for what I would say is optimal for performance. Once again, kids are often oblivious to that sort of a feature, but to those hardcore cycling parents, you might get somebody who would sort of wish for slightly improved quality. As mentioned before, this is an air fork, so we have an air cap, and that just shows the ease of doing things like changing the feel of that fork or increasing the pressure. That's just an air valve down there. We have something like this, a shock pump, and that is all it takes to basically adjust that air pressure. And that is something that you would only ever have to change if your kid basically gains significant amount of weight. Air suspension in general is becoming pretty bulletproof these days, so unlike the old days, it's not like every 3 weeks when you got on you had to put some air in your fork or shock because some had seeped out. Heading back to the cranks, we'll just have a look at the fact that they are using a threaded bottom bracket, and it is an external bearing threaded bottom bracket with a two-piece design with these two clamps here, and that means that your spindle is actually permanently attached to the drive side, and then this is just clamping on. Once again, wish it was shorter, not a total deal breaker. We have pretty clean cable routing. We've seen Marin basically working on this sort of stuff over the years, and I think they're finally getting it to the point that we're not having to strap things down to avoid cables or brake lines from sort of bulging out into unusual places. A quick one back to the fork on here. This is using a through axle on this bike. So that is a proper, stiff, strong front end. The through axle basically meaning that we've got a big fat axle that ties structurally the two sides of the fork together. And even though we're talking about lightweight kids, it reduces the amount of flex that we might be seeing. 180 millimeter rotors, front and rear. So they are thinking about trying to get as much possible braking power for the kid as possible, while we're still looking at a 2-piston Tektro brakes. For a super high performance parent, probably not rider, a parent might sort of nerd out and decide to put some 4-piston brakes on here. Realistically, this is probably pretty good. The one thing with these Tektro brakes is that the brake pads that they use are Shimano compatible, so you can go aftermarket and just put some Shimano brake pads on to slightly improve the feel. Now, when we were back here before, I didn't mention this, but this is a UDH derailleur hanger on here with a tiny caveat on it here that this is a slightly special UDH hanger, and that is because this bike in its stock format is using a what they call a 141 QR rear end. And now this rear end drives some bike nerds absolutely crazy. I see both the pluses and negatives of it. The big deal here is the fact that what it essentially is doing is a way that we're using like a thin quick release style axle going through. That saves, I don't know, 28 cents or something like that during production, but somehow brands like Marin and many others decide that that's a worthwhile spot to save some money. When you go to buy the replacement wheels to move this thing up to 26 inch, the ones that Marin offers in this case are actually 148 through axle. And so this system is quite easily upgraded to a 148 proper boost through axle. And what it takes is replacing your hanger with the proper threaded hanger over here. And then otherwise you do have a proper through axle hole on that side, and the spacing between the dropouts is set up for that 148. So that's kind of what this 141 QR with little adapters on it is doing, is saving Marin 28 cents, one of those things that drives you kind of nuts. But that upgrade to the 26 is available. And that I gotta give Marin a huge shout out. The fact that I noticed that they actually are offering those wheels. We, over the last few years, have called Marin a few times, and it's like, what does my customer do if they want to upgrade from 24 to 26? Because nobody in the bike supply world is offering a Boost 26-inch wheel, it seems. And so they were kind enough to basically use their sourcing from when they're actually getting the stock parts from all of the factories overseas, and they are now going to bring those wheels in. You end up, I would say, the wheels themselves, you're probably looking at spending about $350 to go with the two 26-inch wheels. You'd just be switching your cassette over. I think you have to switch to a different set of brake rotors because those aftermarket ones, if I saw correctly, are center lock. These are 6-bolt. And then you need to buy some tires, of course. So you're probably still in the neighborhood of spending, say, $500, but it's spending $500 to upgrade this rather than spending $2,200 to move up a size. So still at least offering the option, and the fact that they're bringing in those wheels tells me that yes, there are a number of people who are actually going that route of buying the 24 and then switching to 26 2 years after or 3 years after. So those are all the details about this bike, and now I'm going to go into those comparisons that I promised and the big what and why. Either this bike would be the right bike for you, spending roughly $2,700 or $3,200. I'm going to give you 3 options, and the what and why the 3 options each make a lot of sense. So we basically have a 3 bike good, better, best story that really helps to show where money goes and where money can change things to make a bike a little bit better. So to start with, in that good, better, best story, we have the Rift Zone 24. We've been talking about it for the last few minutes here. $21.99, and in this case we have that 130, and that X-Fusion front and rear suspension, and then with our only real criticism beyond the fact that the suspension isn't really optimized for that super light rider, that we've got some cranks that are a little bit too long. So we add an extra $500 to that, and then we will see the Norco Fluid FS. And they've got a new one for 2026 coming out. I haven't seen it in person, but from specs and from being a longtime fan of Norco in general, I'm gonna sort of assume that everything is as good as I expect it to be. And what happens for that extra $500 when we're looking at the Norco Fluid FS Youth, still 24-inch wheels, we get those shorter cranks, 140 millimeter cranks on there. It gets a through axle on the rear end. So I discussed the fact that this one has that 141 QR. And then it also steps up to a Manitou Youth fork on it. So I think the fork is going to improve. Rear shock is basically the same as this. And then those are the standout sort of features that make that extra $500 of that Norco a worthwhile spend. Now, whether or not it's worthwhile for you or not, that's up to you. But just giving you options that this is a way to get a really good bike. If you have an extra $500 burning a hole in your pocket, then you go up to that $2,700 Norco. If you have an extra $1,000 in your pocket, that is when you see the Giant Faith 24. And I have done a video on the Giant Faith with the 27.5 wheels on it. So that one is going to be really applicable because it does share almost all the same sort of technology on those 2 bikes, just with a different frame to suit the different wheel sizes. But that Giant Faith 24, that extra $1,000 over this, so we then go from $21.99 to $31.99, that thing has basically the benchmark fork and shock in this entire category. And I would be willing to say that that goes up against way more expensive bikes, because Giant built their own suspension in that case. So check out that review. If the price doesn't matter to you, if it's just a case of looking for quality, check out the Giant Faith. Absolutely worth the $2,200 or $3,200. It's just whether or not you have $3,200 burning a hole in your pocket. So the Faith gets much better suspension. It goes to quite a bit higher quality wheels, rims, tires, including the fact that they're tubeless tires and set up tubeless from the factory. And in that Faith 24, it has those 140 millimeter cranks. So you do get a few things. There's a couple other sort of notable details. It has a better dropper post, better brakes, those sorts of things. It even brings up some solutions potentially to the fact that this derailleur hangs so low, but it does that at the price of gear range. So not a net improvement there, just a change, but suspension, seat post, forks, all that sort of stuff. Big improvement on that giant Faith 24. So whether or not you have $2,200 or $3,200, or right in between, we have 3 different solutions for you. And to finish with, I will show you if all these prices seem absolutely ridiculous to you. In a second, there will be a different bike right here, and I'll briefly tell you about it. And then maybe someday I'll do a video on that bike so that you can see the details on it. So this is the Marin Bear Valley 24-inch. This is going to be the bike that if you cannot make any sense of everything I've talked about in this video, or if you just don't go on hardcore trails, if your family's trails are relatively smooth, they're green trails, not lots of roots and rocks or jumps or anything like that, something like this might be the solution. And quite frankly, spending the $2,200 in that case might just be a waste of money. So this thing here, 24 pounds, $899. Now, the magic pudding here is the fact that we're not looking at a suspension fork, we're looking at a lightweight aluminum fork. They're putting on a little bit of a bigger volume tire here, so you're getting a little bit of that performance and comfort by just being able to ride these big tires soft. We're looking at a micro shift 1x8 drivetrain, so still a wide enough range of gears to go for a decent ride. Still hydraulic disc brakes, still trigger shifters, so we have all the touch points that a cycling parent would really look for. But if the trails you go on aren't gnarly, this is your solution, and you now end up with an extra $1,300 in your pocket that you can come in here and buy a whole bunch of good stuff for yourself. So that is my coverage of the 3 best bikes in the 24-inch full suspension, and the one bike that I would pick if those full suspension bikes make no sense for you, but you believe in getting your kid on a high quality bike and taking advantage of a company like Marin, who are quite a large volume manufacturer, doing just a better price point version of what some of the real niche kid-only brands are doing out there. So if you like this sort of content, give the old like, give the old ding ding, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for tuning in.